Night shift workers, what is the creepiest thing that has happened to you? There was a time when I worked as a night shift janitor at a high school. My routine was always the same, and to be honest, you eventually get used to the solitude of those empty buildings. My main task each night was to clean a fairly large wing of the school, which had a very distinct U shape and was lined with classrooms on both sides. Since it was already late, my shift was about to end. I had already locked the first set of doors leading into that section and was making my final round to secure the other end of the U. I had spent hours there alone, with only the sound of my footsteps and the echo of the empty hallways. There was nothing out of the ordinary, or so I thought as I finished my chores. Finally, I reached the end of the long corridor, right where the heavy doors connect that wing to the rest of the school. At the exact moment I reached out and flipped the lights off, I saw it. In the middle of the dim light, the dark silhouette of what looked like a small child ran across the back of the hallway, moving from left to right. I froze. My mind tried to process it quickly. There were doors in that area, but I had personally locked all of them just a few minutes prior. I knew perfectly well that no one was left in the building, no teachers, no students, no other cleaning staff. I was totally alone. Fear hit me all at once. I felt a chill run down my entire spine. I didn't stay to investigate. I locked the connecting doors as fast as I could, almost yanking them shut, and bolted toward my car. During the entire time I worked at that school, I always had that uncomfortable feeling that something was watching me or seeing things out of the corner of my eye. But that silhouette was, by far, the clearest and most real experience I ever had in that place. A few years ago, when I was working as a healthcare assistant, I had to cover the night shift at a nursing home. One of my main tasks was to perform hourly breathing rounds, a routine procedure to ensure all residents were stable while they slept. Halfway through my round, as I walked down the dimly lit hallway, I reached the room of a resident named Helen. When I peeked in, I stopped dead in my tracks. I saw the woman sitting bolt upright right at the edge of her bed, staring directly at the door. I thought it was strange, so I stepped a bit closer and asked her in a low voice if she was okay, or if she needed anything. At that moment, she was looking toward the floor, but when she started to look up, she did it in a way that made my blood run cold. Her head twisted from side to side with jerky, almost unnatural movements, until she finally managed to lock her eyes onto mine, without breaking eye contact for a single second, and with a raspy, deep voice that didn't sound like hers, she replied, "Helen isn't here anymore." Panic seized me. I ran out of the room, bolted down the hallway, and reached the nursing station panting to report what had happened. The nurse on duty looked me up and down and let out a small chuckle, telling me that it was physically impossible. Helen was a total care patient, meaning she couldn't move on her own and, furthermore, was barely able to articulate words. Still, she accompanied me back to the room. Not even 2 minutes had passed since I had fled. When we entered, Helen was tucked perfectly into her bed, sound asleep and snoring as if nothing had happened. I will never be able to forget that look, or the way her neck moved in the darkness. The night shift in an ambulance always has something strange about it, but what happened to me on Thanksgiving Day 2016 marked me forever. We received a call for a suicide. It was a man who, just the day before, had found out he had cancer. He didn't want to become a burden to his family and made a drastic decision. It's sad, but sadly common in our line of work. We went, followed protocol, did what we had to do, and started the drive back to the station. The atmosphere in the cab was normal until we reached the parking lot. At the exact moment I was maneuvering into our spot, the ambulance's entire electronic system went completely haywire. The radio started switching stations on its own at high speed. The dashboard lights dimmed and brightened rhythmically, and the cabin lights flickered like something out of a horror movie. My partner and I panicked. We jumped out of the vehicle at breakneck speed, and just as our feet hit the ground, the truck shut down completely. We stood there, staring at each other with blank minds, not understanding what had just happened. After a few seconds of absolute silence, we lit a cigarette to try and calm our nerves. When I finally worked up the courage to check the ignition, I realized the key was still in the on position. I turned the switch off, restarted the engine, and everything worked perfectly. We didn't have a single mechanical or electrical problem for the rest of the shift. I've seen many strange things in this job, and I don't claim to have seen it all, but I am firmly convinced that when we left that scene, we brought something or someone back with us in the rear. I work as a prison officer. When I was just a rookie, I was assigned an overtime shift in the early morning hours in a housing unit with a rather dark reputation. It's a sector that has seen much death and tragedy over the years. It was well past midnight, and in theory, all inmates were supposed to be inside their cells. However, being a medium security prison, inmates are still allowed to leave their rooms and walk through the block to use the communal bathroom during the night. It was around 2 a.m., and I was preparing to perform the mandatory inmate count, a critical task to ensure no one is missing. As I approached the cell area, I clearly saw an inmate walking down the stairs from the second level. I watched him quite naturally, as he walked with a calm pace and entered the unit's communal bathroom. I stopped right at the bathroom entrance and shouted inside, asking which cell he was from. I needed that information to add that extra body to my count sheet for that specific cell and avoid having my numbers off at the end of the round. I received no response. The silence in that cold tiled bathroom was absolute. Puzzled by the lack of respect, I entered the bathroom to look for the guy and reprimand him. I checked every corner, every shower stall, and behind every partition wall, but there was absolutely no one there. I froze, processing the fact that there was no other exit, and I hadn't taken my eyes off the only door for a single second. The next day, I told one of the senior officers what had happened while we were having coffee. Before I could finish explaining the details, he interrupted me and asked a question that made my skin crawl. Was it a tall, very thin guy with long dreadlocks? I was speechless, because that was the exact description of what I had seen coming down the stairs. When I said yes, my colleague sighed and told me with a calm that gave me chills. That's Mr. Bones. He took his own life a few years ago in that very same unit, but it seems he hasn't realized yet that his sentence is already over. To this day, every time I pass those stairs in the early morning, I still feel the same heavy air and the same chills I felt that night. Cultural note. In the correctional system, the term housing unit refers to a self-contained wing or block that groups several cells and service areas. Unlike maximum security prisons where inmates are isolated, in medium security facilities, these units allow for some nighttime mobility within the block. This explains why a guard might see an inmate moving toward common areas like bathrooms without initially considering it a security breach or an escape attempt. I worked as a security guard on a university campus, and one of my nightly tasks was to lock up the main building of the law school. The building was located in the heart of a major city, and was so old that the tunnels running beneath its foundations had been part of the Underground Railroad in the 19th century. Imagine the scene: packed dirt floors, low ceilings, and crossed wooden beams that creaked under the weight of the structure above. At that time, maintenance work was being done in the tunnels, apparently to reinforce the wooden supports that were already badly deteriorated. As part of my routine, I had to go down and make sure the place was empty before locking everything up completely. I carefully climbed down the ladder into the absolute darkness of the tunnel. All the contractor's lights were off, leaving only the circle of light from my flashlight to guide me. I stood still for a moment and shouted several times, "Hello? Is anyone here?" I got only silence in response, a heavy, dusty silence that seemed to soak up the sound. But just as I was getting ready to climb back up, I heard it. From deep within the tunnel, a melody began to play. It wasn't modern music. It was clearly a radio tune from the 1920s, with that characteristic hiss and the metallic tone of old-time broadcasts. The sound didn't come from any modern worker's radio. It sounded as if it were trapped in time, echoing between the wooden beams. I didn't stay to investigate the frequency. I climbed up the ladder 3 rungs at a time, locked the hatch with a heavy padlock, armed the motion sensors, and got out of there as fast as my legs would carry me. To hell with that, there are echoes in those tunnels that are better left undisturbed. This story didn't happen to me, but to a good friend who worked the graveyard shift at a water treatment plant. His job was basically surveillance and maintenance, checking levels, adjusting valves, and making sure nothing exploded while the rest of the world slept. He was completely alone on the premises. Although the building doors were unlocked, the entire complex was surrounded by an imposing 7-foot barbed wire fence with the gates padlocked shut. The plant is situated next to a state highway connecting 2 cities an hour apart, with absolutely nothing but fields and darkness in between. It was around 2:30 or 3 a.m. My friend was killing time, sitting and playing with his Nintendo DS, when suddenly, a freezing voice behind his back broke the silence. "On the ground, now." My friend froze, feeling his heart stop for a second. He obeyed immediately. He was being held at gunpoint. The assailant began to tie his hands and feet with electrical tape. The strangest thing is that, while he was immobilizing him, the guy kept apologizing, saying he was very sorry he had to do this. Once he had him subdued, he stole the keys to his truck, his wallet with all his cards, and his phone. My friend heard the engine of his own vehicle roar and speed away down the highway. He waited for what felt like an eternity, struggling against the tape, until he managed to free himself enough to call for help. The police managed to arrest the suspect later that same day. It turned out the man had escaped from inmate custody in the neighboring city and was desperate to get out of the area. He had probably been walking along the highway for hours before jumping the plant's fence. Even though the assailant was captured, my friend suffered from severe PTSD for a long time. Believe it or not, he still works at the same place, but he says that now, the silence of the early morning never feels as peaceful as it did before. Cultural note: water treatment plants are considered critical infrastructure, but due to automation, they often operate with minimal staff at night. Because they are frequently located in peripheral or isolated areas to avoid odors and noise in residential zones, they become vulnerable spots for people seeking shelter or escape vehicles. In terms of industrial security, incidents like this often force the implementation of lone worker protocols, which include man-down alarm devices or constant camera monitoring from external central stations. Like what you see? Subscribe to the Reddit Oracle for more. For a while, I worked the night shift at a drug rehabilitation center. It was a place heavy with dark stories and a very dense energy. From the moment I arrived, patients constantly reported strange things happening in the early morning hours, and colleagues who had worked my position before warned me about various apparitions they had witnessed in the hallways. There was one room in particular that was the center of all the rumors. The client sleeping there suffered from sleep paralysis with alarming frequency. Additionally, I noticed cold spots in that room myself. Even in the dead of winter with the heat on full blast, you'd feel a frigid air upon entering that chilled you to the bone. At the time, I tried to be rational and thought everything had a logical explanation. But one night, that logic crumbled. I was doing my routine hourly rounds. When I reached that specific room, I reached out to open the door, but I stopped dead in my tracks. The doorknob began to turn slowly before my eyes, exactly as if someone from the other side was trying to get out. I thought it was no big deal. Sometimes patients can't sleep and come out to talk for a bit or have a cigarette. Out of courtesy, I took a step back and moved to the side to let the person pass. The door opened completely in front of me, but the hallway was empty. There was no one there. I went inside immediately, thinking maybe it was a prank, but the layout of the room made it physically impossible for someone to open the door and crawl back to their bed without me seeing them. The patients were fast asleep. That was the exact moment I went from being a skeptic to a total believer. There was talk of many other terrifying things at the center, but experiencing that firsthand changed how I view my work forever. For a long time, I worked as the night shift manager at a gas station that also served fast food. It was a place that never closed, operating 24 hours a day in one of the roughest and most dangerous parts of the city. If you work in a place like that, you end up accumulating hundreds of stories about the crazy things the addicts wandering the area do. To be honest, most of those experiences weren't exactly terrifying, but rather absurd moments that made you wonder what the hell was going on. I still remember a guy who, out of nowhere, gave me a magic crystal. He told me, dead serious, that it would protect me from the apocalypse, all because minutes before, I had covered the few cents he was short for some hot dogs. Another time, a guy tried to pay for a pack of cigarettes with fresh grass clippings. He looked me in the eye and said, "Look, I know this isn't weed, but I swear it works almost as well." Then, he fell completely asleep, standing up, leaning against my cash register. However, the most disturbing story of all was when I discovered the bodies. Two men, who were regulars at the store, had decided to hide in the dumpster area to use. When I went to check the area, I found them lying there. I immediately called 911, and while the ambulance was on its way, I tried to apply what little first aid knowledge I had, desperately searching for a sign of life. When the paramedics arrived and assessed the scene, they told me with a coldness that chilled my bones that both had probably been dead for hours. They based this on how cold their bodies were to the touch. But here is where logic fails me. I could swear on everything holy that, while I was trying to help them, I felt a faint pulse, and what haunts me the most is that I clearly remember hearing a gurgling sound coming from their throats. The doctors insist it was an illusion or a natural process of the body after death, but to me that sound was far too real. I worked for a while as a night shift baker in a busy downtown area. The job was quiet, but being awake when the rest of the world sleeps exposes you to situations that still haunt me today. Two incidents in particular remained etched in my memory. The first involves the parking lot. In that area, parking at night is free, but it's always full, so finding a spot close by is a matter of luck. One night, I had to park a block away. As I walked to work, I noticed a young guy on a bicycle. He started riding in circles around my car and then around me. He followed me very closely to the building's entrance, and I had to rush inside to shake him off. The strangest part was that when my boss arrived at 4 a.m., he told me the exact same story. That guy had circled him on the bike in an intimidating way. This repeated for several days. Each night, the guy became bolder and got closer to us. On the last day, he tried to directly ram my boss with the bike, who had to jump between two vehicles to avoid the hit and escape safely. After that attempted assault, we never saw the cyclist again. The second incident happened during the summer. On my breaks, I used to sit outside on a well-lit, busy side street. At the end of that street was an imposing federal building, and between my spot and that building, there was nothing but a solid wall. One of those nights, while I was resting, I looked toward the federal building and saw a person walking toward me. The strange thing is, it was a figure completely shrouded in shadows. Even when he passed right under the powerful streetlights, I couldn't see a single feature of his face or his clothes. It was like a walking void. I felt a sensation of malevolence so pure and terrifying that I ran back inside. I stayed glued to the door, waiting to see who passed by the window, but 10 minutes went by and no one crossed. That person simply vanished on a street with no exits. It's been 15 years, and I still shudder remembering that darkness walking toward me. Buckle up, because this story is intense. I no longer work night shifts, but for years I worked in residential care facilities. The most terrifying experience of my career happened in a unit dedicated exclusively to dementia patients. It was a lone working facility, which means I was the only person there to watch over 15 residents with D3 level dementia. There was no one else, just me in the silence of the building. It was around 3 a.m. I had just finished one of my intentional surveillance rounds when, suddenly, I heard the front doorbell ring. Immediately, a wave of chills washed over me. This was a locked, secure facility, and it was the middle of the night. No one should have been ringing the door. I went to the window and looked out. There was absolutely no one. I tried to calm myself down and dismissed it as a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. However, 10 minutes later, the doorbell rang again. At that point, I was already terrified. I went back to the window and checked again once more. The entrance was empty, but looking toward the street, I noticed a strange car parked right in front. Out of pure instinct, I took a photo of it with my phone, just in case. I went back to my workstation to try and normalize the situation. One of our patients was there, a lovely woman, but very affected by her illness, with whom I had been playing card suit matching to keep her calm. I sat with her, and out of nowhere she looked at me and asked, "What did the gentleman want, dear?" He looked like he'd had a bad night and needed a cup of tea. My blood ran cold. I tried to brush it off because hallucinations are common in dementia, but that coincidence was too exact. Less than 5 minutes later, the bell rang for a third time. At that point, I was losing my mind with fear. Another one of my residents, who used to walk the hallways, painting the walls with a dry brush to stay busy, passed by me as I ran toward the window. He stopped, looked me dead in the eye and said, "Don't open the door alone. He could hurt you." Then he just kept on, painting. I was on the verge of tears. I was a 23-year-old girl alone, in charge of 15 vulnerable people, and my on-call supervisor wasn't answering the phone. She never did on weekends. I looked out the window again, and this time I saw a shadow moving in front of the door. Suddenly, a person rounded the corner and looked directly through the window where I was standing. Our eyes locked, and I let out a piercing scream. Panic gripped the residents. I was collapsing, and the individual just ran off and vanished. I called the police, and when they arrived, everything was chaos. I had 15 residents awake and agitated by the commotion and the presence of the officers. My boss still wasn't answering. It took me hours to stabilize the place with tea, hot drinks, and emergency medication for the most difficult residents. At 7 a.m., the relief shift arrived. When I told them what happened, my heart sank. They informed me that, just on that same street, a woman had been attacked in her bed that night by an addict looking for narcotics. I had a total internal breakdown thinking about our medicine cabinet. We had supplies of morphine, methadone, and fentanyl. I can't help but think that man was looking for us, looking for those drugs, and when he couldn't get in, he went to the house next door. The center was an old guest house renovated in an elegant residential area, surrounded by doctors' houses, so it was easy to mistake it for a normal home. Shortly after, I quit. The company refused to hire a second person for the night shift, even though we were below safety standards. I hadn't remembered this in about 5 years. And wow, it still hurts to remember. If you like these stories, make sure to subscribe to the Reddit Oracle.